Screenwriting is essentially scene writing. When we've gone through all of our process of planning out our scenes and having our outlines, what we are going to do is going to write scenes. We're going to write dialogues, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but mostly what we're going to do is we're writing scenes. Instinctively, we know what scenes are. When we're watching a movie, we know what scenes are. Like a scene starts, a scene ends, we know what they are. But if we're going to define them in a very didactic way, and that's important for us because it's always important to know what we're doing before we do it. What is a scene? A scene is a unit of story. You can divide your story in different ways. You have acts, you have sequences. We have classes about those here on the channel. And then you have scenes. And what is a scene? A scene is a unit of story that contains conflict. Okay. There's almost always conflict in scenes unless there's an establishing shot or a transition scene. We'll talk about that in more or less continuous time and space. Okay. So it's action through conflict. Things happen in a scene in more or less continuous time and space. It's usually more time continuous in time. And then there's some variation in space. Maybe a scene starts here and ends somewhere else, but it's usually continuous in time, right? There's a time jump between scenes, but when we're in a scene tends to be continuous in time, and there's action through conflict. Action means something happens, and conflict means there's opposing desires. Whole classes about conflict here on the channel as well. It's a unit of story that contains action through conflict in more or less continuous time and space. What determines the start and the end of the scene is the action, is what happens, and not the location. So, for example, if there's a scene in which a boss fires an employee, the scene might start at his office and might end on the floor of the factory, but it's one scene. It's the scene where employee gets fired. Okay. So we have to think about what the action is and what the conflict is. Okay. In essence, and as a rule of thumb, all scenes contain conflict, unless you're doing it on purpose. We call those breathers. Okay, we're taking a breath. We've had 5, 6, 7, 8 scenes that have so much conflict. So you take a breath. It's a calm scene with no conflict, but then you're doing it on purpose. If you have multiple scenes with no conflict, it could get a little boring. Okay, so let's think about what the conflict of it is of each scene. So, what is the function of the scene? What is the function of the scene? Why do we write scenes? Scenes are written to either advance plot, reveal character, or both. Really good scenes do both at the same time. There's an iconic scene in Silence of the Lambs where Hannibal Lecter asks Clarice to reveal things about her past while he gives her clues that are going to help her solve her case. That's a perfect example of a scene that does both. It advances our understanding of the character, it reveals Clarice's character, and it's advancing the plot. It's getting Clarice closer to catching Buffalo Bill. So that's the function of your scene. If your scene is not advancing the plot and it's not deepening the audience's understanding of the character, you have two options. One, you rewrite the scene so it does one of those two things. Two, you cut it. Okay, those are your two options. You rewrite the scene or you cut the scene so it does those things. You can have scenes that all they do is reveal character. For example, in the beginning of Boogie Nights, we follow each of our characters home, and all we see is there's no real plot development there. We see Julianne Moore's character calling her ex-husband and trying to talk to her kid on the phone while she does cocaine. We see William C. Macy get home while his wife's sleeping with someone else and she asks him to close the door. We see Mark Wahlberg's character getting home and he has all the posters and he's looking at himself in the mirror. It's not really advancing plot, but it's deepening our understanding of our character. So action through conflict in more or less continuous time and space that advances plot and reveals character. A really good example of a scene, for example, that advances plot is in Almost Famous when William gets the phone call from Ben Fong Torres and says, can you pitch me a story? And he pitches Stillwater and he's like, good, please write me a story, 1,000 words, $1,000, whatever it is. 1,000 words seems like a very short story, but it advances plot, right? So William Miller was living his normal life. And by the end of that scene, now he has an assignment. Okay. So that is a scene that advances plot. A scene is broken down into beats. Beats are every time there is a little shift within a scene. If your scene is starting to run long, if it starts to fall flat, maybe it's because you need to add some beats. And what are beats? Beats are every time there is a change in the subject in a conversation, a character enters, a character exits, something happens in the scene. It's every time there's a little tiny little shifts within a scene. So if everyone's talking around the table and then one of the characters spills wine, that's a beat. And then the other character starts crying, but because of a different reason, that's another beat. Then the doorbell rings, that's another beat. So a scene is comprised by beats. A scene also has elements. We need to know what certain elements are in the scene. And these elements might be a little familiar if you have any experience with journalism, because they're the same elements that are in a first paragraph of a news story. And they are who, where, what, why, and how. Let's talk a little bit about those. You can access the PowerPoint here on the description of the video, and then there's actual scenes on the PowerPoint that you can watch at your own time. So what is the who of the scene? The who is whose scene is it? Who is the protagonist of the scene? A lot of times it's the protagonist of the movie, but it might not be. Okay? Your protagonist of the scene might be someone else. So it's whoever has a goal in the scene, and we'll get to that in a second. So for example, in Jaws, which is a movie that I talk about a lot on this channel, there's a scene where there's been a huge shark attack, and then they get all together and they're like, there's $10,000 to kill the shark. And then Hooper, who is the protagonist of the scene, even though Brody is the protagonist of the movie, he says, I'm not going to do it for whatever the bounty is. I want way more money, but I'll kill the shark for you. So that's his scene. His goal is to offer himself up for the services for more money. He's the protagonist of the scene, even though he's not the protagonist of the movie. So that's the who. Whose scene is it? Who has a goal in the scene? Even if the scene it's like a two-hander, there's two people in the scene, it's not a bad idea creatively to ground yourself in one character. One character is trying to do something, the other character is trying to block them. Protagonism, antagonism within a scene. So that's the who. Where? Where are we? What's the location? And how is this location going to help us better tell this story? There's a concept in storytelling called bouncing off the walls. Have your character interact with their location. In the first few scenes of Everything Everywhere All at Once, we see Evelyn constantly interacting with her space. They're at the laundromat. There are clients. There's shoes in the laundromat. There's googly eyes on the thing, right? There's constantly there's a ceiling that's been painted a different color white. There's constant interactions between the character and her environment, and the environment interferes in the character's life as well. I have an example of a student once that wrote a script, and it was a conversation that it was a single mom who was a film producer and her kid, and they were talking over microwave dinner at home. Eventually, when he rewrote the scene, he had the exact same conversation held at a small art house movie theater minutes before the movie started. So there were people around them. They had to have the same conversation in hushed tones. There was a ticking time bomb because the movie was about to start. So they had to have the conversation quick. Just by moving that dialogue into a new location, by changing the where, the scene kind of elevated and came to life. So think about your location, bounce off the walls, have the environment be part of the scene as well, and not just a backdrop. So when we talk about the what, right? Who, where, what? The what can be two different things. The what can mean, what is the goal that your character has within the scene? Okay. So what is the goal your character has? So for example, there's a wonderful scene in this perfect movie called Almost Famous, which I adore, and I will reference a few times here. It's here in the scene is here on the PowerPoint, where William Miller tries to get into the backstage to interview Black Sabbath. That is his goal in the scene. So that's the what of the scene. What's the goal that your character has in the scene? Another way to look at the what is the function of the scene? We talked about that, right? What is the function? So what is the scene doing for you? What's it doing to the plot, and what's it doing to your understanding of the character? So that the what is like what A and what B. What A is what's the goal of the character in the scene, and what B, what's the goal that you have as a writer by writing. How and why. The how alludes to strategies. What are some of the different strategies your character is going to use in order to achieve their goal in the scene? So for example, William Miller is trying to get into backstage to interview Black Sabbath, but there's an obstacle, which is the bouncer. The bouncer says, you are not on the list. So that scene is going to have William try many different strategies to get backstage. He tries to show the bouncer he's a journalist by showing the magazine. He tries to go in with the groupie / band-aids. None of that works. He keeps getting blocked by this bouncer. Eventually, he meets Stillwater, which is the band that's eventually going to be what the movie's about. And then he convinces the band that he's a fan of the band and not just a critic. And then that's how he finally gets in backstage to interview Black Sabbath. Okay. What that's the how. What are the different strategies our characters are using within the scene to achieve what they want? It could be manipulation, convincing, begging, crying, whatever it is. What are some of the certain strategies? This is really good for actors. Actors really thrive when they know they have different strategies to use within a scene. The why is the motivation. Why is our character doing what they're doing? We do not have to establish a motivation in every single scene as long as we know why our character is doing what they're doing. If you did a good job laying the foundation, we know why our characters are doing what they're doing. We don't need to be reminded that Brody wants to kill the shark to save his community every single scene. We know that. So the motivation, unless it's something really unexpected, as long as we know what the motivation is, you don't have to establish it every single scene. I think that's pretty intuitive. A really important element of scene writing, and this is something that Robert McKee talks about a lot, okay, is the idea of change and emotional value. So what's Robert McKee's thesis? Okay, the thesis is that every scene represents change. By the end of the scene, the story has changed, our understanding of the character has changed, something has changed. So what that means is that this change has to be kind of represented somehow. And what Robert McKee says is that this change is going to be represented by emotional value. So scenes will go from negative to positive, positive to negative, neutral positive, neutral to negative. If you are going to stay in the same emotional zone, as long as there's like a clear difference, you should be fine. I'll give some examples. So in Jaws, okay, there's a really well written scene of the big shark attack, the one that happens on the beach that's very gruesome, that makes everyone know that there's a shark in the water. That scene starts out pretty positive. Everyone's having a good time at the beach. It's summer, it's great. By the end of the scene, a little boy has been killed. So it went from positive to negative. The example I want to give that stays within the negative to negative space is, for example, in Kramer versus Kramer, the scene where Billy and his dad are having dinner and Billy is complaining at how he doesn't like the food. It's already a little negative. He's complaining about the food. His dad has no patience. It's negative. They're in an emotionally negative space. But then what happens is Billy goes into the freezer and he gets ice cream and he eats ice cream. He defies his father, who ends up grabbing him and throwing him on the bed and calling him names. So it goes from negative to triple, quadruple negative. So when you're writing your scenes, if their scene is falling flat, that's probably what it means. It probably means it's staying in the same emotional level the whole time. So it's not a bad way to think about your scenes in terms of what is the emotional charge in the beginning and what is the emotional charge at the end. So in Almost Famous, the scene where he's backstage, it starts negative, right? Because he's being blocked by the bouncer. He can't go in. It starts negative, but it ends positive because he goes in. Okay. So emotional charge is a really interesting concept in scene writing, and I highly recommend that you actually be very purposeful about it when you're outlining. When we're writing scenes, we're usually trying to write them from a little bit of an instinctive place. We're going to that place, like that zone, and we're writing, and we're not overthinking necessarily the who, the what, the why, the how. And that's fine, because that's the process. We put it on screen, we put it on paper, and then we come back later and we edit it, we rewrite it, right? My kid, when she's writing stories, she calls them a sketch. I love that idea. It's a sketch. It's a draft, right? We're not writing our final drafts the first time around. And that's very, very true to scene writing. So you might write a scene and it might feel clunky, but you write it anyway because we're not perfectionists here. We have to get it on paper no matter what and fix it later. The fix it later is where we can come in and kind of use our editor hat to, like our story editor hat, to rewrite our scenes and get a little bit of more gold out of this. And there are a few things you can do. One, you can see if their scene has a clear protagonist and a clear antagonist and a clear goal. Okay. You can see if your scene has your change in emotional value. But then there are also other techniques that you can use. One is what everyone calls in media res. What is in media res? It means in the middle of things. You start the scene in the middle of the action. You start your scene in the middle of a chase, in the middle of a storm. Okay, there's a fantastic scene in Seven, the movie by David Fincher, where we just see Brad Pitt arriving at a crime scene and we don't really know what's happening. We just see him get there. And in Silence of the Lambs, she's in the middle of an argument with the asylum director. He's like, "What you're doing is you're coming here and you're refusing to share information with me." There's no buildup. You're dropping your audience in the middle of the action and you're letting your audience catch up in media res. We start late in scenes and we end early. We don't need to see the whole buildup up to the action. Find what the action of the scene is and see how it feels to cut really a lot of that stuff up to it. The same thing with ending early. We start late and we end early. What is the action of the scene? See how it feels to cut everything else out. You could always do Control Z and it all comes back. End early. End as soon as you've delivered your narrative message. Okay. There is a concept in comedy writing called the button. And the button, what does that mean? It means that's your funniest line of dialogue in the scene. And what do? You cut after the button. Even if you're not writing comedy, I believe this is wonderful advice in writing. Find what is the strongest moment of your scene. What's the best line of dialogue? What's the strongest visual? What's the most shocking moment? What's the most moving moment? Cut and see what happens. You could always fix it later. So that's in media res. So that's a very, very good technique for rewriting. By all means, write the whole thing. Write 5 pages, even if at the end of the thing, you're only going to use 3/4 of a page. Okay. So that's what in media res is. Start late and early. Another good little technique you could do is the plant and the payoff, right? What's a plant and a payoff? What we're trying to avoid is Deus ex machina. I'm giving a lot of terms of like Latin and Greek today. Deus ex machina means the God as machine, the God that rises from the sky and save our hero, even though it has nothing to do with the story. We're trying to avoid that. We're trying to have our character solve all their problems their own way. So what's a plant and a payoff? A very classic example is when 007 gets introduced to all the gadgets he has access to. Those are plants. Okay, this is a lipstick that's actually a camera. This is a tie that becomes a bomb. This is an umbrella that shoots poison. You know later that those are going to be used in action. That's the payoff. We plant it at the beginning, then we pay it off later. Okay, really, movies that did that really well recently were Paddington 2, where everything in the beginning doesn't feel like a plant, like the way that she swims and she dives and all that stuff pays off later. Mitchell versus the Machine, same thing with the little like the I totally forgot the like Phillips flop head, whatever, the screwdriver. The screwdriver is a plant that keeps paying off over and over and throughout this movie. So it seems meaningless in the beginning and then it pays off later. So that's something you can incorporate in your scene. Another really good technique you can use in your scene writing is the bomb under the table. And what does that mean, the bomb under the table? I'll explain. So Hitchcock, we call him the master of suspense, right? And he used to say this. So imagine the following scene. We have 2 lovers talking over dinner about the weather, okay? And they talk for 30 seconds, and then the camera pans to under the table, and there's a bomb under the table. And then now we've created tension, right? We've created tension, and we have tension until that bomb explodes. If you invert that, if you start with the camera on under the table, and now there's a bomb under the table, and the camera pans up, and on top of the table and over the table, there are 2 lovers talking about the weather. We are so tense now. We're tense because they're talking about the weather, and there's a bomb under the table. So that's the bomb under the table. And what that leads us to is this idea of dramatic irony. And what is dramatic irony? There are so many convoluted explanations of what dramatic irony is out there, but it is actually a very simple concept, which is we as an audience know more than the characters on screen. That's what dramatic irony is. I know this character is lying, the other character doesn't know. I know there's a bomb under the table, the other character doesn't know. It could be used for comedy, for misunderstandings, for the example, and There's Something About Mary, there's a wonderful scene where Ben Stiller thinks he's admitting to murder when all he's doing is telling them that he gave a hitchhiker a ride, but he doesn't know that hitchhiker was murdered. So he's confessing to murder, but he's not. But it's funny because we know more than he does. Okay. It's also used in suspense a lot. So for example, the young woman walks into her house and she's clueless, but we know there's a killer hiding, right? So that's what dramatic irony is. So sometimes if you're writing a scene, you can play around with dramatic irony. Who knows information? Who knows more information? Who knows less information? Hopefully, that is a helpful tool for your toolkit. Please subscribe, share, whatever if you like this content, and please give me suggestions for topics if you like through the comments. You can always talk to me through the comments, and I'll always get back to you. And thank you so much for watching.